He paid just $850 for a rusted shipping container that everyone called a death trap. But when the floor gave way beneath his daughter's toy box, what he found in the vault below would either save his family or destroy everything he'd fought to protect. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The rain hammered against the tin roof of the shipping container like 1,000 angry fists, each drop echoing through the hollow metal shell that Marcus Webb now called home. He sat on the edge of a salvaged mattress, head in his calloused hands, listening to his 8-year-old daughter Lily breathing softly in the makeshift bedroom he'd created by hanging sheets from the ceiling. The container smelled like rust and regret, and something else he couldn't quite name, something that reminded him of abandoned places and broken dreams. But it was theirs. Barely. Marcus was 34 but felt twice that age. The mirror in the gas station bathroom where he washed up most mornings showed a face he barely recognized anymore. Deep lines carved paths from the corners of his eyes, etched there by sleepless nights and the kind of worry that never fully goes away. His dark hair, once thick and carefully styled, now hung shaggy and unkempt because haircuts cost money better spent on Lily. His hands were perpetually stained with grease, dirt, and the residue of a dozen different jobs. They were the hands of a man who'd learned that survival meant never saying no to work, no matter how hard or how humble. 2 years ago, Marcus had been a different person. He'd had a wife, Sarah, the kind of woman who lit up rooms just by walking into them. She'd been his high school sweetheart, the girl who'd believed in him when he was just a kid with big dreams and no clear path forward. They'd gotten married young, maybe too young, some people said, but it had worked. She'd been a teacher at Pine Haven Elementary, beloved by her students, known for keeping goldfish crackers in her desk for kids who came to school hungry. She'd made their small rental house feel like a palace with her thrift store decorating and the way she hummed while cooking dinner. Then came the diagnosis. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months. She fought for 8. Every day a battle she faced with more grace than Marcus could comprehend. He'd watched her fade, watched the strongest person he'd ever known become fragile and small, watched Lily try to understand why Mommy couldn't play anymore, why Mommy slept so much, why Mommy cried when she thought no one was looking. The medical bills started arriving before Sarah died and didn't stop after she was gone. Insurance covered some of it, but not the experimental treatments Marcus had insisted on trying. Not the specialists in Portland, not the medications that cost more per dose than he made in a week. He'd maxed out credit cards, taken loans from family members who'd given the money reluctantly, their faces tight with judgment disguised as concern. He'd sold everything that wasn't nailed down. Their car, their furniture, Sarah's jewelry except for her wedding ring which he kept in his pocket always, pressing his thumb against it when the world felt too heavy. It hadn't been enough. The medical debt was crushing, a mountain of numbers that made his vision blur when he tried to add it up. $173,000. That's what loving someone cost. That's what trying to save a life cost when the universe had already decided otherwise. They'd lost the rental house 6 months after Sarah died. The eviction notice had been taped to the door on a Tuesday morning, and Marcus had torn it down before Lily could see it. They'd moved into his truck for a while, parking behind the grocery store where the night manager looked the other way. Then winter came to Oregon with its cold rain and bitter wind, and Marcus knew they couldn't survive another night in that truck. That's when he'd started looking for anything, any shelter they could afford. Pine Haven, Oregon was the kind of town time forgot. Population 3,214 according to the faded sign on Route 26, though Marcus suspected that number was optimistic. It sat in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains, surrounded by Douglas fir forests that had once fed a thriving timber industry. But the mills had mostly shut down in the 90s, and what remained were struggling families, boarded-up storefronts, and a pervasive sense that better days were behind them. Marcus had grown up here, left for college in Portland with dreams of becoming an architect, and returned with Sarah to raise Lily near family. His parents had retired to Arizona, uncomfortable with the reality of his poverty, sending occasional checks that felt more like obligations than love. Sarah's parents had passed years ago. He had a sister in Seattle who'd stopped returning his calls after he'd asked to borrow money one too many times. In a town where everyone knew everyone, Marcus had never felt more alone. He worked 3 jobs now, though calling them jobs felt generous. They were survival, nothing more. Mornings started at 5:30 at Cascade Lumber, the last remaining timber operation in town. Marcus hauled 2x4s, stacked plywood, and loaded delivery trucks until his back screamed and his shoulders burned. The work was brutal, the kind that aged men fast, but it paid $9 an hour and didn't ask questions about his situation. His co-workers were mostly older men who'd worked there for decades, their faces weathered like old leather, their bodies bent from years of heavy lifting. They didn't talk much, just grunted acknowledgments and shared cigarettes during breaks that were never long enough. The foreman, a thick-necked man named Dale, had pulled Marcus aside during his first week. "You got that look," Dale had said, not unkindly. "The desperate look. Whatever you're running from, work hard and I won't ask about it." Marcus had just nodded, grateful for the mercy of silence. Afternoons were for odd jobs. Marcus had printed flyers on cheap paper at the library, stapling them to telephone poles around town. Handyman services, no job too small, fair prices. His phone, a battered flip model that Sarah had used, rang sporadically. Fix a fence, clean out a garage, repair a porch step, paint a shed. The work was unpredictable, and the people who hired him often paid in cash, pulled from cookie jars and dresser drawers, small bills counted out carefully by hands that shook with age or hardship. One regular client was an elderly woman named Rose who lived alone in a yellow house with a sagging porch. She'd hired Marcus to replace rotted boards, and when he'd finished, she'd insisted on paying him with both cash and a plate of cookies. "You've got kind eyes," she'd said, studying his face. "Hard times don't make bad people, they just make tired ones." Marcus had nearly cried right there on her porch. Evenings belonged to the Pine Haven Diner, a greasy spoon on Route 26 that served truckers, locals, and the occasional lost tourist. Marcus washed dishes from 6 until midnight or later, standing at an industrial sink that never seemed to empty, his hands raw from scalding water and harsh soap. The kitchen was hot and loud, filled with the clatter of plates, the sizzle of griddles, and the shouted orders of cooks who'd long ago stopped caring about anything except getting through their shifts. The owner, a heavy-set man named Frank, paid Marcus under the table, $7 an hour, but with the understanding that Marcus could take home leftovers at the end of each night. Those leftovers, half-eaten burgers and cold fries and congealed soup, became Lily's dinners. Marcus would heat them up on a hot plate them carefully, and pretend they were fresh. Lily never complained. She'd learned at 8 years old that complaining changed nothing. Between all 3 jobs, Marcus pulled in maybe $1,100 a month. Barely enough to keep them fed. Not enough for rent anywhere in town, not even the worst apartments. Not enough for dignity. That's when he saw the notice. It was a Friday afternoon in November, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and refused to leave. Marcus had stopped by the post office to mail a payment on one of his medical debts, $5 toward a balance of $12,000. The payment felt futile, like bailing out the ocean with a teaspoon, but he couldn't afford to have the debt sent to collections. Not again. The community bulletin board was covered with the usual notices: lost cat, guitar lessons, church bake sale. And then, tucked in the corner, barely visible beneath a flyer for firewood, was a simple white paper with large black letters. Estate sale, abandoned property, shipping container home, as is, no reserve. Saturday, November 9th, 9 a.m. An address was listed at the bottom, and Marcus recognized it immediately. Everyone in Pine Haven knew that property. It sat on the far edge of town, past the old quarry, where the paved road turned to gravel and the trees grew so thick they blocked out the sun. 12 acres of scrubland that nobody wanted, surrounded by chain-link fence that had rusted and sagged like tired shoulders. The shipping container had been there for almost 20 years. Some recluse had bought the land, had a 40-foot industrial container delivered, and converted it into a home. Then he'd vanished. Just disappeared one day, and nobody knew where or why. The county had eventually seized the property for back taxes, and it had sat empty ever since, a curiosity that locals drove past but never investigated too closely. Marcus stared at the notice for a long time. His mind did the math it always did, calculating impossibilities, measuring his desperation against his options. A home, an actual structure with walls and a roof, on 12 acres of land. It didn't matter that it was a shipping container. It didn't matter that people said it was falling apart. It was shelter, and shelter was survival. He tore the notice from the bulletin board and stuffed it in his pocket. That night, after his shift at the diner, Marcus drove past the property. His truck's headlights swept across the gate, illuminating the rusted chain and faded "No Trespassing" sign. Beyond it, barely visible in the darkness, was the container. Even from the road, it looked rough. The paint had faded from whatever color it once was to a mottled gray-green. One of the corners sagged, but it was there. Real. Possible. Marcus sat in his truck for 20 minutes, engine idling, watching his breath fog in the cold air. Could he really do this? Buy a shipping container and move his daughter into it? What choice did he have? Saturday morning arrived gray and cold. Marcus woke Lily at 7, helped her into her warmest clothes, layers of everything they owned. Her jacket was too small, bought 2 years ago when Sarah was still alive and the sleeves barely reached her wrists. Marcus made a mental note to find her a new one somehow, somewhere. "Where are we going?" Lily asked, her voice still thick with sleep. "To look at a house," Marcus said, trying to sound optimistic. "A real house?" Her eyes widened with hope that broke his heart. "Sort of," he said carefully. "It's different, but it could be ours." They drove out to the property in silence. Lily stared out the window at the passing trees, and Marcus wondered what she was thinking. She'd become so quiet since Sarah died, as if she'd learned that her sadness was too heavy for the world to carry. She rarely cried anymore, rarely laughed either. She just existed, small and careful, trying not to take up too much space in a life that had already taken so much from her. The auction site was already busy when they arrived. Maybe 20 people clustered near the gate, most of them curious onlookers rather than serious bidders. Marcus recognized faces from town. Dale from the lumberyard, standing with his arms crossed and a skeptical expression. A couple of real estate speculators in clean jackets who were clearly interested in the land, not the structure. A few scrappers hoping to buy cheap and sell the metal. And then there were the whispers. Marcus heard them as he walked past. "That's Marcus Webb. Heard he's living in his truck. Poor guy, lost his wife. Wonder if he's actually going to bid on this dump." The words stung, but Marcus kept his head down. He'd learned to swallow his pride along with everything else. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man named Roger, someone Marcus vaguely remembered from high school. Roger had gone into his father's business, handling estate sales and foreclosures, making money off other people's misfortune. He stood on the tailgate of his truck with a clipboard, looking bored. "All right, folks, let's get this show on the road," Roger called out. "I've got 3 more sales today. This here's 12 acres of unincorporated land with one 40-foot shipping container structure. Property's been abandoned for 15 years, no utilities hooked up, buyer assumes all liens and back taxes. We're selling as is, which means what you see is what you get, and believe me, what you see ain't much. A few people chuckled. Now, there's about $800 in back taxes owed, plus fees, so keep that in mind. We'll start the bidding at $500 for the whole lot. Silence. Marcus felt his heart pounding. $500. He had $623 to his name, money scraped together from 3 months of saving every penny he could. It was supposed to last them through the end of the month. Rent for the parking spot behind the grocery store where they'd been sleeping, gas for his truck, food for Lily. 500? Do I hear 500? Roger scanned the crowd. No hands went up. Come on, people. 12 acres of land. That's dirt cheap. Someone snorted. It's just dirt, Roger. Nobody wants land you can't build on. 400 then. Do I hear 400? Nothing. Marcus glanced at Lily. She was holding his hand tightly, looking up at him with those big brown eyes that were so much like Sarah's it physically hurt. 300? Roger was starting to sound annoyed. Still nothing. All right, forget it. 200. Somebody give me $200. A man in the back raised his hand. 100. That's all it's worth. Roger sighed. We got 100. Do I hear 150? Silence. 150? Anyone? Marcus's hand shot up before his brain could stop it. Every head turned to stare at him. We have 150, Roger said. Do I hear 200? The man in the back shook his head and walked away. The crowd murmured, the whispers louder now. He's actually buying it. Must be desperate. That thing's a death trap. Going once, Roger called out. Going twice. Marcus held his breath. The gavel came down. Sold for $150 to bidder number 9. The crowd dispersed quickly, people shaking their heads, clearly convinced Marcus had just made the worst decision of his life. Maybe they were right. Marcus walked forward on shaking legs to sign the paperwork. Roger handed him a stack of forms, and Marcus's stomach sank as he read through them. The bid price, $150. Processing fee, $75. Title transfer fee, $150. Back taxes, $375. Filing fees, permits, documentation. The total came to $850. Marcus stared at the number. That left him with enough money for maybe 2 weeks of food if they were careful. No margin for error. No backup plan. No safety net at all. You sure about this, son? Roger asked, his voice lower, almost kind. That container's been sitting there for 15 years. No telling what condition it's in inside. Marcus looked at Lily, who was standing a few feet away, watching him with an expression that was equal parts hope and resignation. I'm sure, Marcus said and signed his name. Roger handed him a key, rough and poorly cut, the kind made in someone's garage. Good luck, he said, and it didn't sound like a pleasantry. It sounded like a warning. By noon, Marcus had transferred what few belongings they had from the truck to the container. It didn't take long. They owned almost nothing. Lily's clothes fit in one garbage bag, Marcus's in another. A box of books Lily refused to part with, a stuffed rabbit named Buttons that Sarah had given her before she got too sick to go shopping, a photo album that Marcus couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bear to leave behind. The gate to the property was chained, but the chain was so rusted that Marcus was able to cut through it with bolt cutters borrowed from Dale. He drove his truck up the overgrown driveway, weeds scraping against the undercarriage, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Up close, the shipping container looked even worse than it had from the road. It was massive, 40 feet long and 8 feet wide, sitting on concrete blocks that had settled unevenly over the years. The paint had faded and peeled, revealing rust that had eaten through the metal in places. Someone had cut windows into the sides, but several were cracked or missing entirely, covered with plywood that had warped from moisture. The door hung crooked on its hinges, the frame bent from years of neglect. Marcus stood in front of it for a long moment, the key heavy in his hand. It looks like a giant Band-Aid, Lily said quietly. Despite everything, Marcus laughed. The sound surprised him, rusty from disuse. "Yeah," he said, kneeling down to her level. "It does, but you know what? We're going to make it work. We're going to make it home. Promise?" Her voice was so small. Marcus pulled her close, breathing in the scent of the cheap shampoo from the community center shower where they'd washed that morning. "I promise, baby. I promise." The key turned in the lock with a grinding sound that made Marcus wince. The door swung open with a groan of protesting metal, and they stepped inside. The smell hit first: damp, mildew, rust, and something else, something stale and forgotten, like the air itself had been sealed away and gone sour. Marcus's eyes adjusted to the dimness, and what he saw made his heart sink even further. The previous owner had done rough renovations, cutting the container into sections with plywood walls that had warped and buckled with moisture. Water stains streaked the walls, brown and yellow and green with mold. The floor was plywood laid over the original metal, sections of it soft and spongy where water had gotten underneath. There was a tiny kitchen area, if you could call it that. A rust-stained sink that probably didn't work, connected to pipes that went nowhere. A hot plate sitting on a warped countertop. A mini fridge that was unplugged and had clearly been that way for years, its door hanging open to reveal black mold inside. A chemical toilet sat behind a mildewed curtain, the kind you'd see at construction sites. The plastic was cracked and yellowed. The main living space was maybe 15 feet by 10 feet, with a ceiling so low Marcus had to duck to avoid hitting his head on exposed support beams. Someone had tried to insulate the walls with fiberglass, but much of it had fallen down, revealing the metal skin of the container beneath. At the back was a smaller alcove, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, separated by more plywood. This would be Lily's room. Marcus wanted to cry. He wanted to get back in his truck and drive until the gas ran out. He wanted to go back in time and make different choices, be a different person, live a different life. But Lily was looking at him, and he couldn't let her see his despair. "Well," he said, forcing brightness into his voice, "it needs some work." "Some?" Lily said, and there was the tiniest hint of her old humor in her voice, the spark he remembered from before. "Okay, a lot of work," Marcus admitted, "but we can do it, right?" Lily walked to the small alcove and peeked inside. There was one window, cracked but intact, looking out onto a tangle of pine trees. The floor was less damaged here, more solid. "This can be my room?" she asked. "All yours," Marcus said. She set buttons on the floor carefully, positioning the stuffed rabbit just so. Then she turned back to Marcus. "Can we make it pretty?" Marcus knelt beside her, his throat tight. "We're going to try, baby. We're going to try real hard." That first night was brutal. November in Oregon meant temperatures that dropped into the 30s, and the container had no heat. Marcus piled every blanket they owned onto Lily's mattress, a twin-size thing he'd found beside a dumpster and cleaned as best he could. He hung sheets from the ceiling to create a sense of her own space, to give her some privacy, some dignity in this undignified situation. He made her peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, the bread a little stale, the peanut butter generic brand that stuck to the roof of your mouth. They ate by flashlight because there was no electricity. "Tell me a story," Lily said after she'd finished eating, curled under her pile of blankets. Marcus sat beside her mattress, his back against the cold metal wall. "What kind of story?" "The one about when you and Mommy met." It was her favorite, had been since Sarah got sick. Marcus had told it 100 times, maybe more, each retelling a small act of keeping Sarah alive in their hearts. "I was 16, Marcus began, the words familiar as breathing. "Your mom was 15. It was the first day of school, and I was late because my car wouldn't start. I ran into homeroom right as the bell rang and crashed into someone. Books went everywhere. I looked up, ready to apologize, and there was your mom." "What did she look like?" Lily prompted, even though she knew. "The most beautiful girl I'd ever seen, brown eyes that sparkled like they knew a secret, Messy hair she kept trying to push out of her face. She was wearing this yellow dress with sunflowers on it. "And what did you say?" I said, "I'm sorry." And she laughed and said, "You should be. You stepped on my favorite book." I'd landed right on top of her copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The spine was cracked. "So what did you do?" "I bought her a new one, used my lawn mowing money, and when I gave it to her the next day, she said, 'You didn't have to do that.' And I said, 'I wanted to.' And she smiled this smile that made my whole heart stop." Lily smiled too, her eyes already closing. "She loved you right away." "Not right away," Marcus said softly. "But eventually. And every day after that, I tried to be the person she thought I was, the good person she saw." "You're still that person, Daddy," Lily murmured, already half asleep. Marcus sat there until her breathing evened out, watching her small form under the blankets. Then he moved to the main room and lay down on the floor. He had no mattress for himself, just a sleeping bag that was too thin and a jacket rolled up as a pillow. The cold seeped through the floor. The wind howled through gaps in the walls. Somewhere in the darkness, water dripped steadily, a leak he'd have to find and fix tomorrow. Marcus stared up at the low ceiling and wondered, not for the first time, if Sarah was watching. If she could see what had become of them. If she was disappointed in him for ending up here, in a rusted shipping container at the edge of nowhere. "I'm doing my best," he whispered to the darkness, to her ghost, to himself. "I'm doing my best." The next morning, Marcus woke before dawn to discover frost on the inside of the windows. His breath came out in visible puffs. His back ached from sleeping on the hard floor, but Lily was warm and safe, and that was all that mattered. He made her instant oatmeal on the hot plate, using water from the gallon jugs he'd filled at the gas station. Then he walked her to the end of the long driveway to wait for the school bus. She looked so small standing there in her too small jacket, her backpack almost as big as she was. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, but her eyes were wet. "Hey." He tilted her chin up gently. "We're going to make this work. I promise." "I miss Mommy," she whispered. Marcus pulled her close, feeling his own tears threatening. "Me too, baby. Me too. Every single day." When the bus came, he watched until it disappeared around the bend, then walked back to the container with heavy steps. He had 4 hours before his shift at the lumber yard. Time to start making this place livable, if that was even possible. He began by assessing the damage, notebook in hand, writing down everything that needed fixing. The list grew longer with every minute. Patch holes in the walls, replace damaged floor sections, fix the leaking roof, figure out the toilet situation, connect water somehow, get electricity running, insulate properly, make it warm. The tasks felt impossible, overwhelming, but Marcus had learned that impossible just meant doing one small thing at a time until the big thing was done. He started with the holes. Using scrap wood he found scattered around the property, old pallets that had been dumped years ago, fallen branches, anything he could salvage. He began patching gaps in the walls. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep the worst of the wind out. He worked methodically, measuring, cutting, nailing. His hands remembered the motions from high school shop class, from helping his father build a deck one summer, from all the odd jobs over the years. The work was meditative, allowing his mind to quiet. But as he was prying up a damaged section of floor near what would be Lily's room, something stopped him. The plywood came up easily, too easily, like it had never been properly secured, and underneath, instead of the metal floor of the shipping container, there was a gap, just darkness. Marcus frowned, pulled up another board. More gap. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it down. Metal. Smooth, riveted metal. But not the corrugated walls of a shipping container. This was different. Engineered. Deliberate. A floor beneath the floor. Marcus sat back on his heels, his pulse quickening. Why would there be a second floor? Shipping containers didn't have false bottoms. They were one solid piece of steel. Unless someone had built it. On purpose. He pulled up more boards, exposing a larger section. The hidden floor ran the full length of the container, at least as far as he could see, and there, barely visible in the shadows, was a seam, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Marcus traced it with his finger. It formed a perfect rectangle, maybe 3 feet by 6 feet. At one end, recessed into the metal, was a keyhole. His breath caught in his throat. Someone had sealed something under here, hidden it deliberately, built an entire false floor to conceal it. The recluse! The man who'd vanished! What had he been hiding? Marcus's hands shook as he tried to remember if there had been any other keys, anything else in the documents from the auction, but there had only been one key, the one to the door. He thought about the toolbox he'd found. He'd been clearing brush from the property yesterday and had uncovered an old toolbox buried under a tarp near the back fence. He'd assumed it was trash, just random junk left behind, but inside had been strange items. Wrenches that didn't fit any standard bolt size, a compass that seemed broken, pointing in the wrong direction, and a small brass key with a worn handle that looked like it had been used countless times. Marcus scrambled to his feet and ran outside. The toolbox was still where he'd left it, and he dumped its contents onto the ground. There, the brass key. Back inside, his hands trembled as he fitted the key into the recessed lock. It turned. Something clicked deep below, mechanical and precise. Then, with a hiss of escaping air, the entire floor panel lifted an inch, as if on hidden hydraulics. Marcus grabbed the edge and pulled. It was heavy, reinforced steel, but it moved smoothly on mechanisms that had been waiting, preserved, ready. The panel rose, revealing a ladder descending into complete darkness. Marcus stood at the edge, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to close it, to pretend he'd never seen it. This was something hidden for a reason, something secret, possibly something dangerous. But curiosity has a gravity of its own, and Marcus had always been the kind of person who needed to know, needed to understand. He grabbed his flashlight, checked to make sure it was bright, and lowered himself onto the ladder. Rung by rung, he descended into the unknown, leaving the weak November sunlight behind, climbing down into a darkness that had been sealed for years, maybe decades. His boots hit solid ground, and he stood in what appeared to be a tunnel. No, not a tunnel. The space was too finished, too intentional. A vault. Marcus shined his flashlight forward, and his breath stopped. The beam illuminated steel shelving units lining the walls, and on those shelves, stacked in neat rows, were boxes. Metal boxes, plastic containers, wooden crates, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Marcus took a step forward, then another, his light cutting through the darkness. What the hell had he just found? And more importantly, what was inside? Marcus stood at the bottom of the ladder, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness that felt thick as water. The air down here was different. Cold, yes, but also dry and stale, like it had been sealed away from the world for so long it had forgotten what living air tasted like. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, and he couldn't tell if it was from fear or the descent or the weight of what he was seeing. The vault stretched before him, longer than he'd expected. 20 feet, maybe more. The walls were concrete, rough and hand-carved, like someone had dug this out themselves over months or years. The ceiling was reinforced with steel beams, and he could see where they'd been anchored into the bedrock above. This wasn't amateur work. This was engineering. This was someone who'd known exactly what they were doing and had the resources to do it right. Marcus moved forward slowly, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. His flashlight swept across the shelving units, and with each pass, his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The shelves were industrial grade, the kind you'd find in a warehouse, bolted to the walls and floor for stability. And on every shelf, arranged with obsessive precision, were containers. He reached the first shelf and pulled down a box. It was heavier than it looked, a metal case about the size of a shoebox with a simple latch. His fingers fumbled with it for a moment before it clicked open. Marcus nearly dropped it. Inside were stacks of cash, $100 bills bound in plastic wrap with rubber bands around them. Each bundle was labeled with dates written in permanent marker. March 2006. The bills looked pristine, uncirculated, like they'd come straight from a bank and been sealed away immediately. His hands shaking, Marcus set the box down and opened another one. More cash. Different dates. August 1998. The bills were older, the designs different, but the denomination was the same. Hundreds. All hundreds. He opened a third box, a fourth, a fifth. Every single one contained money. Marcus stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his grip and clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly before settling at an angle, casting long shadows across the vault. He bent to pick it up, his legs weak, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be fake. Movie prop money, counterfeit, some kind of elaborate joke left behind by a crazy person. But his hands knew the truth. The weight was right. The texture was right. The smell, that distinct scent of old paper and ink, was unmistakably real. Marcus forced himself to move deeper into the vault to see what else was here. The next set of shelves held different containers, heavier ones. He pulled one down and nearly dropped it from the weight. Inside were gold coins, hundreds of them, sealed in plastic tubes with labels. American eagles, Canadian maple leafs, Krugerrands. Each tube contained 20 coins, and there were at least 50 tubes in this box alone. Another box held silver bars stamped with serial numbers and assayer marks. Another contained bearer bonds in protective plastic sleeves, the kind that were as good as cash if you knew where to take them. Stock certificates for companies he recognized, blue-chip corporations that had survived decades of market changes, more bonds, more gold, more cash. Box after box after box. Marcus's legs gave out, and he sat down hard on the cold concrete floor. His flashlight beam illuminated a small section of the vault, but his mind was seeing something much larger. The sheer volume of wealth here was incomprehensible. This wasn't a nest egg. This wasn't savings. This was a fortune. How much? 1 million? 10 million? More? He had no frame of reference for this kind of money. He'd spent the last 2 years worried about having enough for groceries, counting pennies at the gas station, choosing between heating and eating. And now he was sitting in a vault that contained more wealth than everyone in Pinehaven combined probably saw in their entire lives. His breathing was coming too fast. Panic was setting in. Marcus pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to think, trying to process, trying to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do. A sound from above made him freeze. Footsteps. No, not footsteps. Just the container settling, the metal creaking as the day warmed. But it was enough to jolt him back to reality. Lily. The school bus would be bringing her back in a few hours. He couldn't be down here when she got home. He couldn't let her see this, not yet, not until he understood what it was and what it meant. Marcus stood on unsteady legs and made himself explore the rest of the vault. At the far end, partially hidden in shadow, was a wooden desk. An actual oak desk with a high-backed chair, sitting there in the underground darkness like someone had been working here, living here almost. The desk's surface was covered with papers, all neatly stacked and organized. Marcus approached it like he was approaching something sacred or dangerous. He wasn't sure which. He set his flashlight on the desk, angling it so he could see, and began to look through the papers. There were ledgers, columns of numbers in precise handwriting, asset lists, transfer dates, locations, everything meticulously documented. There were photographs, yellowed with age, showing a man at different stages of his life, young and confident in a business suit, middle-aged and tired at what looked like a corporate retreat, older and haunted, standing in front of this very shipping container. And then Marcus found the journal. It was leather-bound, thick, the kind of book that cost real money. The leather was soft with age and use, and when Marcus opened it, the pages crackled slightly. The first entry was dated September 4th, 2003, written in the same precise handwriting he'd seen on the ledgers. "My name is Arthur Brennan," it began. "If you're reading this, then I am dead or disappeared, and you've found my life's work. I don't expect mercy. I don't expect understanding. But I do expect you to make a choice." Marcus sank into the chair, his eyes racing over the pages. The journal was long, hundreds of pages, filled with Arthur Brennan's confession, justification, and final testament. He wrote about his life, his career, his sins, and his attempt at redemption. Marcus read hungrily, frantically, trying to understand who this man was and what he'd created here. Arthur Brennan had been born in 1958 in Portland, Oregon. Brilliant from an early age, he'd earned degrees from Stanford and Harvard, had been recruited by Goldman Sachs before he was 30. By 40, he'd started his own hedge fund, Brennan Capital Management, and had made himself and his investors impossibly wealthy. The journal detailed his methods. He'd been ruthless, aggressive, the kind of Wall Street predator who saw markets as battlegrounds and other investors as prey. He'd made billions in the tech boom, shorting companies just before they collapsed, buying distressed assets for pennies and flipping them for fortunes. He'd helped orchestrate hostile takeovers that destroyed companies and left thousands unemployed. He'd used insider information, skirted regulations, and crushed competitors without remorse. "I told myself I was just better at the game," Arthur wrote, "that the people who lost were weak, unprepared, undeserving. I convinced myself that wealth was merit, that my success proved my superiority. I was wrong about everything." The journal detailed his transformation. It started small, a news article about a factory closure that Arthur's fund had engineered. 1,500 people lost their jobs. The article included interviews with workers, people with families, with mortgages, with dreams that ended the day Arthur decided their company was worth more dead than alive. One worker had been a man named Robert Chen, 53 years old, father of 3. He'd worked at that factory for 28 years, starting on the line and working his way up to shift supervisor. When the factory closed, he'd lost everything. 6 months later, he'd committed suicide. "His daughter wrote me a letter," Arthur's journal continued. "She said her father had been a good man who'd worked hard his whole life, and people like me had destroyed him for sport. She said she hoped I could sleep at night knowing what I'd done. The truth was, I couldn't. Not anymore." That was 1996. Arthur was 38, at the peak of his power and influence, and something broke inside him. He started seeing the faces behind the numbers, started understanding that every percentage point on his balance sheet represented real people, real lives, real suffering. He couldn't undo what he'd done, couldn't bring back the jobs or the companies or the people like Robert Chen. But he could stop, he could withdraw, he could disappear. Over the next 7 years, Arthur systematically liquidated his fortune. He moved assets carefully, slowly, converting everything to cash, gold, and bearer instruments that couldn't be traced. He told his partners he was retiring, told his investors he was closing the fund, told his lawyers he wanted privacy. Most people assumed he was dying or going crazy. Maybe he was both. He bought this land in Pine Haven in 2002. The journal described his plan: create a sanctuary, a vault, a place where his wealth could be hidden away until he figured out what to do with it. He'd considered giving it all to charity, but he didn't trust the big organizations. Too much overhead, too many administrators taking their cut. He'd considered creating a foundation, but that meant lawyers and publicity and questions he didn't want to answer. So he decided to wait, to hide it, to preserve it until he was ready, or until someone else found it and made the choice he couldn't make. "I know this seems cowardly," Arthur wrote, "and perhaps it is. But I've lost faith in institutions, in systems, in the mechanisms that are supposed to help people. I've lost faith in myself most of all. So I'm leaving this decision to chance, to fate, to whoever purchases this property and discovers what lies beneath. Maybe that person will be better than me. Maybe they'll have the courage I lacked. The journal entries became less frequent after 2004. Arthur wrote about his isolation, his paranoia, his growing certainty that someone was coming for him. He didn't specify who: federal investigators, former business partners, someone seeking revenge, but the fear was palpable in every word. The final entry was dated May 18, 2005. I heard them today. Cars on the road slowing down when they pass. Maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe I've finally gone insane, but I don't think so. They're coming. I'm out of time. If you're reading this, stranger, know that this money was earned through suffering. It was built on the backs of people who deserved better. Use it wisely. Use it to help those the system failed. Those people like Robert Chen and his daughter. Those who work hard and still lose everything. Give them what I took. Give them hope. That's all I can ask. That's all I can hope for. Arthur Brennan. Marcus set the journal down with trembling hands. His mind was spinning, trying to process everything he'd just read. Arthur Brennan. The name tickled something in his memory. Something he'd heard on the news years ago when he and Sarah were still in Portland before they'd moved back to Pine Haven. He needed to verify this. Needed to know if any of it was true or if this was just the elaborate fantasy of a disturbed mind. Marcus climbed back up the ladder, his legs shaky, and emerged into the weak afternoon sunlight filtering through the container's cracked windows. He checked his watch. He had 2 hours before Lily got home. 2 hours to figure out what he'd just found. He drove into town, to the public library, a small building that smelled like old books and desperation. The librarian, a woman named Margaret who'd known Marcus since he was a kid, looked up when he entered. "Marcus," she said warmly, "haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy," he said, trying to sound casual. "Can I use one of the computers?" "Of course. You remember how to sign in?" He did. Marcus sat at one of the ancient desktop computers and opened a browser. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard for a moment. Then he typed, "Arthur Brennan, hedge fund manager." The results filled the screen immediately. "Portland billionaire vanishes without trace." That was from the Oregonian, June 2005. Arthur Brennan, hedge fund titan, presumed dead after year-long absence. Wall Street Journal, June 2006. FBI closes investigation into missing financier. Arthur Brennan. Bloomberg, January 2008. Marcus clicked through article after article, his eyes scanning rapidly. The story was consistent across all sources. Arthur Brennan, founder of Brennan Capital Management, had been one of the most successful and controversial investors of the 90s. His fund had managed over $8 billion at its peak. He'd been known for aggressive tactics, hostile takeovers, and an almost supernatural ability to predict market movements. Then, in 2002, he'd abruptly retired, closed his fund, returned money to investors, and disappeared from public view. His family, a sister and 2 nieces, had reported him missing in June 2005 when they couldn't reach him for his birthday. Authorities had searched for him, found nothing. His bank accounts were emptied, his properties sold. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist. In 2008, he was declared legally dead. His estate, what little remained of it, had gone to his family. The vast fortune he'd once controlled was never recovered. Investigators assumed he'd moved it offshore, hidden it in shell corporations, taken it with him to whatever new identity he'd assumed. But they'd been wrong. It was here, under Marcus's shipping container, hidden in a hand-dug vault in the middle of nowhere. Marcus sat back in the chair, his mind reeling. This was real, all of it. The money, the gold, the bonds. It was Arthur Brennan's fortune, and somehow, impossibly, Marcus owned it now. Or did he? That was the question that made his stomach churn. Just because the money was on his property didn't mean it was legally his. Arthur had family. The government might have claims. There could be creditors, victims, lawsuits. This wasn't like finding a lost wallet and keeping the $20 inside. This was different. This was dangerous. Marcus logged off the computer and drove back to the container in a daze. He pulled up just as the school bus was dropping Lily off at the end of the driveway. She ran to him, her backpack bouncing, and for a moment everything felt normal, just a father and daughter at the end of a school day. "How was school?" he asked, hugging her tight. "Okay," she said. "We learned about fractions. I don't like fractions." "Nobody likes fractions," Marcus agreed. "They're fraction ally annoying." She groaned at the pun but smiled, and that smile was worth more than all the gold in the vault. That evening, after Lily was fed and tucked into bed, Marcus sat alone in the main room of the container. The entrance to the vault was closed, sealed, hidden beneath the plywood floor he'd carefully replaced. To anyone looking, it was just damaged flooring that needed repair. Nothing suspicious, nothing extraordinary. But Marcus knew what was down there, could feel the weight of it pressing up through the floor, heavy as gravity. $260 million. That's what Arthur's ledger suggested, maybe more, depending on how the market had moved over the years, how much the gold was worth now, how the bonds had matured. An amount of money so large Marcus couldn't even conceptualize it. He'd spent the evening trying to calculate it in terms he understood. It was roughly 20,000 years of his current income from all 3 jobs. It was enough to pay off his medical debt 4,000 times over. It was enough to buy every house in Pine Haven and still have money left over. It was impossible, absurd, terrifying, because Marcus understood something fundamental about money at this scale. It didn't just change your life. It changed who you were. It changed how people saw you. It changed the very fabric of your existence, and not always for the better. He thought about Sarah. What would she do? She'd been the ethical one, the one who saw things in clear terms of right and wrong. She would have wanted him to do the right thing. But what was the right thing? Turn it in? To whom? The government. They'd take it all, tie it up in bureaucracy for years, and Marcus would get nothing except maybe a small reward if he was lucky. He'd be right back where he started, broke and desperate, living in a shipping container with a daughter who deserved so much more. Keep it? How? If he suddenly started spending money, people would notice. They'd ask questions, someone would investigate. And even if he could hide the spending, was it right to keep money that Arthur Brennan himself had said was earned through suffering? Money built on the destruction of people's lives. Could Marcus live with that? His mind went to Arthur's final words in the journal. Use it to help those the system failed. That felt right. That felt like something Sarah would approve of. But how? How could one person, one broke dishwasher living in a shipping container, possibly manage that kind of wealth responsibly? He'd need help, legal help, financial help. But who could he trust? The answer came to him slowly. Donald Reeves. Donald was 72, a retired lawyer who'd practiced estate law in Pine Haven for 40 years before a stroke slowed him down. He lived alone in a small house near the center of town, and Marcus had done odd jobs for him over the past year. Fixed his porch, cleared his gutters, shoveled snow from his driveway. Donald had always been kind, paying Marcus more than the work was worth, never asking questions that made him feel small or ashamed. If anyone in Pine Haven could be trusted with this secret, it was Donald. Marcus made his decision. Tomorrow, after his shift at the lumber yard, he'd talk to Donald. He'd tell him everything and hope the old lawyer could help him figure out what to do. But tonight, he needed to secure the vault, make sure no one else could find it. He spent 2 hours carefully replacing the floor, making sure every board was secure, every seam invisible. He moved furniture over the entrance, a table and some boxes, making it look natural. Then he changed the lock on the container's main door, installing a deadbolt he'd bought at the hardware store on credit. It wasn't perfect security, but it was something. Finally, exhausted and overwhelmed, Marcus lay down on his sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept spinning, kept calculating, kept imagining all the ways this could go right and all the ways it could go catastrophically wrong. At some point, long after midnight, he finally drifted off. And he dreamed of Arthur Brennan, standing in the vault, surrounded by his horde of guilt, asking Marcus the same question over and over. What will you choose? What will you choose? What will you choose? The next day moved in a blur. Marcus went through the motions at the lumber yard, hauling boards and stacking pallets, but his mind was elsewhere. Dale noticed. "You okay?" the foreman asked during their morning break. "You look like you haven't slept." "Rough night," Marcus said, which was true enough. "I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. He was terrified and exhilarated and paralyzed by the enormity of what he'd discovered. Every car that drove past the lumberyard made him tense. Every stranger who looked his way made him paranoid. Had someone seen him at the library? Had Margaret noticed what he was researching? Did anyone suspect? He was being ridiculous, he knew. No one had any reason to think he'd found anything. He was just Marcus Webb, the broke dishwasher, the desperate single dad, the guy everyone pitied. Nobody expected anything from him, and that invisibility was suddenly the most valuable thing he owned. After his shift, Marcus drove straight to Donald's house. The old lawyer was on his porch reading a newspaper, wearing a cardigan despite the afternoon warmth. He looked up when Marcus pulled in, his expression shifting from pleasant surprise to concern. "Marcus," he said, "everything all right? You look terrible, son." Marcus climbed out of his truck, his legs weak. "I need to talk to you, privately. It's important." Donald set down his paper, his expression sharpening. "Come inside." They sat in Donald's cluttered living room, surrounded by law books and photographs of a life well lived. The old man poured them both coffee from a pot that had been sitting too long, but Marcus barely noticed the bitter taste. "I bought that property," Marcus began, "the shipping container on Milner Road." "I heard," Donald said. "Folks are saying you paid too much for a rust bucket." "There's something under it," Marcus said, and then the whole story poured out. The false floor, the vault, the boxes of cash and gold, Arthur Brennan's journal, the fortune hidden for 15 years. Donald didn't interrupt, didn't show shock or disbelief. He just listened, his weathered face thoughtful, his eyes sharp despite his age. When Marcus finished, the old lawyer sat back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. "Arthur Brennan," he said quietly. "I remember when he disappeared. The whole state was looking for him. FBI, SEC, everyone." "Do you think it's really his?" Marcus asked. "If the journal and documentation are as detailed as you say, almost certainly," Donald replied. "But that doesn't necessarily mean it's yours." Marcus's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Donald stood, walked to his bookshelf and pulled down a thick legal tome. He flipped through pages, found what he was looking for, and set it on the coffee table between them. "Oregon Abandoned Property Law," he said, "Section 131.550. If property is left unclaimed and the owner is declared legally dead, which Arthur Brennan was 8 years ago, then the property passes to whoever lawfully acquires the land it's on." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. "So it's mine?" "Potentially," Donald said carefully. "But there are significant complications. If Brennan has living heirs, and he does, they could contest. His sister and nieces might claim rightful inheritance. If the government can prove the assets were obtained illegally and given his business practices, they might be able to, they could seize them. If creditors come forward claiming Brennan owed them money, they could file claims." "So what do I do?" Marcus asked, his voice breaking slightly. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Donald looked at him seriously. You have two paths, Marcus. The first is to report it to authorities and hope they decide to give you a reward. That's the safe path, but you'd likely end up with nothing or close to nothing. And the second path? The second path is to claim it legally. File the proper paperwork, establish your ownership of the property and everything on it, and fight for it through the courts. It's risky, it's expensive. It could take years, and there's no guarantee you'd win. Marcus put his head in his hands. I can't afford expensive legal battles. I know, Donald said gently, but I'm a retired lawyer with nothing but time, and I've handled more estate cases than I can count. If you want to try, I'll represent you. Pro bono, at least initially. Marcus looked up, tears in his eyes. Why would you do that? Donald smiled sadly. Because 30 years ago I had a client who was destroyed by men like Arthur Brennan. Lost his business, his home, his marriage. He came to me for help and I couldn't save him. Maybe this is my chance to balance the scales. And maybe, just maybe, that money could do some good in the world if it ends up in the right hands. But I'm not the right hands, Marcus said. I'm just a dishwasher. I don't know how to handle that kind of money. Neither did Arthur Brennan, Donald replied. Not really. He knew how to make it, but he never learned how to use it wisely. Maybe you can be better. They talked for hours, going through scenarios, discussing options, weighing risks. Donald asked detailed questions about the vault, about the documentation, about everything Marcus had found. He made notes in a legal pad, his handwriting surprisingly steady for a man his age. In the meantime, Donald warned as Marcus prepared to leave, you can't tell anyone, not friends, not family. The moment word gets out, you'll have people coming out of the woodwork claiming rights to that money. Relatives you've never met, business partners of Brennan's, con artists and opportunists. What about Lily? Marcus asked. Donald thought for a moment. She's 8. Tell her you found something valuable that grown-ups are working on. Keep it vague. Children can't keep secrets, Marcus. Not because they want to tell, but because they don't understand when something needs to be hidden. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of secrecy settling over him like a heavy coat. That night, back at the container, Marcus couldn't resist going down to the vault one more time. He needed to see it again, to confirm it was real and not some elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and desperation. The vault looked exactly as he'd left it. The boxes of cash, the gold coins, the bearer bonds, Arthur Brennan's journal still sitting on the desk. Marcus sat in the chair and opened the journal to a random page. It was dated November 17th, 2004. Arthur was writing about guilt, about how it accumulated like interest, compounding over time until it became unbearable. I see Robert Chen's face every night, Arthur had written, and all the others. The factory worker in Michigan, the teacher in Ohio who lost her pension, the small business owner in Texas. I'd tell myself I didn't know, that I was too far removed to understand the human cost of my decisions, but ignorance chosen is still a choice, and I chose not to see. Marcus understood that feeling now, the weight of choices, the way consequences rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict or control. He'd bought this property just trying to survive, to give his daughter a roof over her head, and now he was sitting on a decision that could change not just their lives, but potentially many lives. The responsibility was crushing. He climbed back up, sealed the vault, and went to check on Lily. She was asleep, buttons clutched in her arms, her face peaceful in the dim light. Marcus sat beside her mattress and just watched her breathe, this beautiful child who'd lost so much and carried it all with such quiet grace. I don't know what to do, baby, he whispered. But whatever I decide, it's for you. It's always for you. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus lived in a state of constant anxiety. Donald filed paperwork with the county, formally documenting Marcus's purchase of the property and making preliminary claims to any assets found on the land. It was vague enough not to attract immediate attention, but specific enough to establish a legal trail. "We need to move carefully," Donald explained. "Once we formally declare what you've found, the clock starts ticking. Brennan's family will be notified. The IRS will want their cut. It'll become public record, and your life will never be private again." Marcus continued working his 3 jobs, kept up the appearance of normalcy, but he started making small improvements to the container. Not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to make it more livable for Lily. He patched the worst leaks, installed better insulation, managed to get a small propane heater that made the cold nights bearable. He also started researching Arthur Brennan more thoroughly, using the computers at the library during his limited free time. He found articles about the companies Brennan had destroyed, the people who'd lost jobs and savings. He found forums where former employees shared stories of the aftermath, of foreclosures and bankruptcies and families torn apart. And he began to understand the weight Arthur had been carrying. This money wasn't just currency, it was condensed suffering, crystallized pain, the accumulated grief of thousands of people who'd been sacrificed on the altar of profit. Could Marcus really keep it? Even if the law said he could, did he have the right? One evening, as he was walking Lily home from the bus stop, she asked him a question that hit harder than she could possibly know. "Daddy, if you found a lot of money that wasn't yours, would you keep it?" Marcus stopped walking. "Why do you ask?" "We're reading this book in class about a boy who finds a wallet with $100. He keeps it because his family is poor, but then he feels bad." Marcus knelt down to her level. "What do you think he should do?" Lily thought about it, her face serious. "I think he should try to find who it belongs to. But if he can't, maybe he could use it to help people who need it. That way the money does something good even if it started out bad." Marcus hugged her tightly, this wise child who'd somehow figured out in 8 years what many adults never learned. "That's exactly right, baby," he whispered. "That's exactly right." That night, after Lily was asleep, Marcus went down to the vault one final time before Donald filed the formal claim. He sat at Arthur's desk and read through the journal again, more carefully this time, paying attention to the transformation Arthur described. The moment his conscience woke up, the moment he realized that wealth built on suffering was no wealth at all. At the back of the journal, Marcus found something he'd missed before. A letter, tucked into a pocket sewn into the inside back cover. It was addressed to whoever finds this. Marcus opened it with trembling hands and read, "If you're reading this, you've made a choice I couldn't make. You've opened what I sealed. You've discovered what I hid. Now you face the same decision that paralyzed me. What to do with money earned through the suffering of others. I spent 7 years hiding it, telling myself I was waiting for clarity, for the right answer. But the truth is, I was waiting for courage. Courage to face what I'd done. Courage to truly atone. Courage to trust that someone, somewhere might use this better than I ever did. Maybe that person is you. You don't know me, and I don't know you. But if you found this place, if you purchased this forgotten property, then I suspect you understand struggle. You understand what it means to need, to survive on hope and determination. You understand the desperation that comes from systems that don't care whether you live or die. Use that understanding. Use this money not to escape suffering, but to alleviate it in others. Don't make my mistakes. Don't let wealth isolate you from humanity. Stay connected to the struggle even as you rise above it. And if you can't do that, if the money corrupts you as it corrupted me, then I'm sorry. I'm sorry for putting this burden on you. I'm sorry for not being strong enough to use it myself. I'm sorry for all of it. But I'm also hopeful, because sometimes the universe gives us chances we don't deserve, And maybe, just maybe, you're my chance at redemption. Arthur Brennan. Marcus read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. He thought about his own struggles, about Sarah's death, about the medical bills and the evictions and the nights in his truck. He thought about Rose, the elderly woman who'd paid him in cookies, about the families he saw at the diner stretching meals to last, choosing between food and medicine. He thought about Lily and the life she deserved, and he made his choice. He wasn't going to run from this. He wasn't going to hide it or keep it secret forever. He was going to fight for it, legally and publicly, because Arthur Brennan was right. This money needed to do something good. It needed to matter. But first, he had to survive the battle that was coming. Because once Donald filed the formal claim, once the world knew what Marcus had found, everything would change. And there was no going back. The paperwork was filed on a Tuesday morning in December, exactly 3 weeks after Marcus had first opened the vault. Donald had driven to the county courthouse himself, carrying a briefcase filled with documentation, photographs, and carefully worded legal claims. Marcus had wanted to go with him, but Donald had insisted he stay away. The moment we file this, you become a person of interest, Donald had explained. Better if you maintain your normal routine, go to work, pick up Lily from school, act like nothing has changed. But everything had changed. Marcus felt it in his bones, in the way his hands shook as he hauled lumber at the yard, in the way his eyes kept darting to every car that passed the container. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the consequences to arrive. They came faster than he expected. The first call came 3 days after filing. Marcus was at the diner, elbow deep in dishwater, when Frank poked his head into the kitchen. "Phone for you," the owner said, his expression curious. "Says it's urgent." Marcus dried his hands, heart racing. The diner phone was ancient, mounted on the wall near the walk-in freezer. He picked up the receiver. Marcus Webb, a woman's voice, professional and cold. "Yes? My name is Patricia Hollis. I'm an attorney representing the Brennan family estate. I understand you've filed a claim regarding property allegedly belonging to my client's late uncle, Arthur Brennan." Marcus's mouth went dry. "I filed a claim for property found on land I legally purchased." "Mr. Webb, let's not play games. We're aware of the nature of your find. We're also aware that you're a financially desperate individual living in substandard conditions with a minor child. I'm calling to make you a very generous offer." "I'm listening," Marcus said, though every instinct told him this wasn't going to be generous at all. "Withdraw your claim. In exchange, we'll pay you $50,000 as a finder's fee. You'll sign a non-disclosure agreement and everyone walks away happy." $50,000. 6 months ago, that amount would have seemed like winning the lottery. It would have solved his immediate problems, paid his debts, given him breathing room. But now, knowing what was actually down there, it felt like an insult. "I need to think about it," Marcus said. "You have 48 hours. After that, the offer expires, and we pursue more aggressive legal remedies. Your life is difficult enough, Mr. Webb. Don't make it harder." The line went dead. Marcus stood there, receiver in hand, feeling like he'd just been threatened with polite words and a professional tone. He hung up and went back to the dishes, but his hands were shaking so badly he dropped a plate. It shattered on the floor, and Frank came running. "You okay?" the owner asked. "Yeah," Marcus lied. "Just tired." That night, after Lily was asleep, Marcus called Donald and told him about the conversation. "They moved fast," Donald said. "Faster than I expected. That means they're worried. Patricia Hollis is one of the best estate attorneys in Portland. The Brennan family hired serious firepower." "Should I take the offer?" Marcus asked. "That's your decision," Donald replied. $50,000 is real money. It could change your life, but it's a fraction of what's actually there. They're betting you're desperate enough to take it." "I am desperate," Marcus admitted. "I know, but desperation and stupidity aren't the same thing. Sleep on it. We'll talk tomorrow." Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay on his sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, doing math in his head. 50,000 minus taxes would leave maybe 35,000. Enough to pay off a chunk of medical debt. Enough to move into a real apartment. Enough to buy Lily a proper winter coat and new shoes and all the things she needed. But it wouldn't last. Within a year, maybe 2, it would be gone, and he'd be right back where he started, struggling, surviving, one emergency away from disaster. The money in the vault, if he could actually claim it, represented something different. Not just survival, but security. Not just getting by, but having enough to build something, to help others, to honor Arthur Brennan's final wish. Was it worth the fight? He thought of Lily, and knew the answer had to be yes. The next morning, Marcus called Patricia Hollis back. "I'm declining your offer," he said simply. There was a long pause. "That's unfortunate, Mr. Webb. You're making a serious mistake." "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "But it's my mistake to make. We'll see you in court." The line went dead, and Marcus felt a chill run through him. He'd just declared war on people with resources he couldn't imagine. People who could hire teams of lawyers, investigators, experts. People who could bury him in legal fees and procedural motions until he had no choice but to surrender. What had he done? The threats escalated quickly after that. Within a week, word had somehow leaked to the press. Marcus didn't know how, maybe through court documents, maybe through someone at the county office, but suddenly his phone was ringing constantly with reporters wanting interviews. He stopped answering. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Saturday, hand-delivered, left in an envelope taped to the container's door. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Lily walking to the school bus stop that morning, her backpack bouncing as she skipped along the gravel driveway. Beneath the photo, one sentence written in block letters: "Some things are more valuable than money." Marcus saw red. His vision literally blurred with rage. Someone had photographed his daughter. Someone had come onto his property, had watched her, had threatened her. He called Donald immediately. "They threatened Lily." "What?" The old lawyer's voice went sharp. "What exactly happened?" Marcus described the photo, his voice shaking with fury and fear. "Okay, listen to me carefully," Donald said. "Call Sheriff Hayes right now. Report this. Get it on record. Then I'm calling some people. This crosses a line, and we're going to make sure everyone knows it." Marcus hung up and called the sheriff's office. Tom Hayes had been sheriff of Pine Haven for 20 years. A good man who'd gone to high school with Marcus's older cousin. He arrived at the container within 30 minutes, his patrol car kicking up dust on the driveway. "Show me," Tom said, his face grim. Marcus handed him the envelope and photo. Tom studied it carefully, his jaw tightening. "This is a direct threat," he said. "Federal, actually, if we can prove it crossed state lines. I'm going to have our detective look into this. In the meantime, I'll have a deputy do regular drive-bys here. And Marcus?" He looked at him seriously. "You need to be careful. People are talking in town. About you, about this money you supposedly found. There are rumors you're sitting on millions." "I can't confirm or deny," Marcus started. "I don't need you to," Tom interrupted. "I don't care about the money. I care about keeping people safe. You and Lily especially. If these Brennan people are willing to threaten a child, they're dangerous." After Tom left, Marcus sat on the steps of the container, head in his hands. This was spiraling out of control. He'd thought the worst-case scenario was losing the legal battle, going back to being broke. He hadn't imagined his daughter becoming a target. A car pulled up, and Marcus tensed until he saw who it was. Rose, the elderly woman whose porch he'd fixed, was climbing out of her ancient sedan with a casserole dish in her hands. "I heard you might need a friend," she said simply. Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. "How did you hear?" "Small town, honey. Word travels. I also heard some nasty rumors about threats. That true?" Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. Rose set the casserole on the steps and sat down beside him, her old bones creaking. "My husband died 30 years ago," she said. "Left me with nothing but debts and a house I couldn't afford. People in this town helped me, not because I asked, but because that's what communities do when they're working right. Let me help you now."
"I don't need—"
"You need someone to watch Lily when you can't," Rose interrupted firmly. "You need someone the other parents trust, someone who can pick her up from school if there's trouble, someone who won't ask too many questions. I may be old, but I'm not useless yet." Marcus looked at this woman who barely knew him, who was offering help without expectation of return, and felt something crack inside him. "Why would you do this?" "Because you fixed my porch without being asked when you saw it was dangerous. Because you never made me feel like charity when I paid you in cookies. Because I've watched you with that little girl, and I know a good father when I see one." She patted his hand. "And because, frankly, I'm bored. Retirement is duller than everyone promises." Marcus managed a weak smile. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you taste my casserole. My cooking's gone downhill since my cataracts." That evening, after Lily had eaten Rose's surprisingly good chicken casserole and gone to bed, there was another knock at the door. Marcus opened it cautiously to find a man in his 60s, lean and weather-worn, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Marcus Webb? Name's Jack Donovan. I'm a friend of Tom Hayes. He asked me to come by." "Are you a cop?" Marcus asked. "Was. Portland PD, 25 years. Retired detective. Now I mostly fish and irritate my wife." He smiled. "Tom tells me you've got some trouble. The kind that threatens kids." Marcus hesitated, then invited him in. They sat at the rickety table, and Marcus explained the situation, leaving out specific details about the vault, but making clear that powerful people wanted him to abandon his legal claim. Jack listened without interrupting, his cop eyes cataloging everything. When Marcus finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I knew Arthur Brennan," he finally said. Marcus's head snapped up. "What?" "Not well. But back in 2004, 2005, I caught a case. Missing person. Brennan's sister had filed a report. I was assigned to investigate." Jack leaned back. "I talked to his neighbors, his associates. Everyone said the same thing. He'd gone paranoid, isolated himself, was probably having a mental breakdown. The case went cold. We assumed he'd either committed suicide or started a new life somewhere." "Did you ever suspect he might be here?" Marcus asked. "In Pine Haven?" "No. The man had billions. We were looking at tropical islands and European cities. A shipping container in rural Oregon never crossed our radar." Jack shook his head. "But I remember thinking there was something off about the family. The sister, the nieces. They seemed more interested in his money than his safety, asked about his assets before they asked about search efforts." "They've hired lawyers now," Marcus said. "They want the money back." "Of course they do. But here's the thing, Marcus. I still have contacts. People in Portland PD, FBI, even some financial crimes investigators who worked the Brennan case. If you want, I can make some calls. Dig into whether this family has any legitimate claim. See if there's dirt we can use." "I can't pay you," Marcus said. "Didn't ask you to. I'm doing this because threatening kids pisses me off and because Tom vouched for you. That's enough." Over the next 2 weeks, an unlikely alliance formed around Marcus. Donald handled the legal strategy, filing motions, arguing precedents, building their case for ownership. Jack worked his old contacts, investigating the Brennan family's background and their attorney's tactics. Rose became Lily's unofficial guardian, picking her up from school, bringing over meals, providing a stable presence that allowed Marcus to focus on the fight ahead. And slowly, surprisingly, the town started to shift. It began with Dale at the lumberyard. Marcus had expected to be fired once word got out about the money, figured Dale wouldn't want the distraction. Instead, the foreman pulled him aside one morning. Heard you're having some trouble with lawyers, Dale said, his gruff voice almost gentle.
Yeah, Marcus admitted. You need time off for court or meetings. You let me know. We'll work around it.
Marcus blinked, surprised. You're not worried about the publicity? Dale shrugged. You've been a good worker. Never complained, never caused problems. Whatever you found on your land, you found it legal. That's all I need to know. The support spread. Frank at the diner told Marcus he could work flexible hours. The librarian, Margaret, quietly showed him how to access legal databases from the library computers. Even people who'd barely spoken to him before started nodding greetings on the street, offering small kindnesses. It wasn't universal. Some people still whispered, still judged, still assumed Marcus was some kind of con artist or thief, but enough people stood with him that he no longer felt completely alone. The court date was set for January 23rd. Marcus spent the weeks before in a state of constant anxiety, working with Donald to prepare testimony, reviewing documents, trying to understand legal concepts that felt deliberately designed to confuse normal people. Jack's investigation yielded interesting results. The Brennan family, it turned out, wasn't as clean as they pretended. Arthur's sister had been sued twice for fraud in her own business dealings. One of the nieces had a DUI and a restraining order from an ex-boyfriend. The family's attorney, Patricia Hollis, had been sanctioned by the state bar for aggressive tactics in a previous case. None of this proves they don't have a claim, Jack explained, but it gives us ammunition, shows they're not the innocent, grieving family they're portraying themselves as. Donald was more cautious. The judge will focus on the law, not on character issues. We need to prove 3 things: that you legally purchased the property, that the assets were abandoned with Arthur's death, and that no other valid claim supersedes yours.
Can we prove that? Marcus asked.
I think so, but it's going to be close. The night before the court hearing, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept going over everything in his mind, all the arguments, all the evidence, all the things that could go wrong. Around midnight, he gave up and went down to the vault one last time. He sat at Arthur's desk and pulled out the journal, reading passages he'd practically memorized by now. Arthur's guilt, his paralysis, his hope that whoever found this would be braver than he'd been. Marcus thought about his own life, about the choices that had led him here, loving Sarah, losing her, fighting to keep Lily safe and fed, buying this container as a last desperate act of survival. None of it had been heroic. He'd just been trying to get through each day. But maybe that was enough. Maybe the universe didn't choose heroes. It just chose people who were willing to keep going when everything else said to quit. He climbed back up and checked on Lily one more time. She was sleeping peacefully, buttons clutched to her chest. Marcus kissed her forehead gently. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he whispered, "I did this for you. I hope you'll understand that someday." The courthouse in Salem was bigger and more intimidating than Marcus had imagined. Donald had driven them, Rose had stayed back with Lily, and Jack had come along for moral support. They sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, waiting to be called, while well-dressed lawyers strode past with briefcases and confident expressions. Patricia Hollis arrived with her clients, Arthur's sister Margaret and niece Sarah. They looked exactly as Marcus had imagined. Polished, expensive, radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. Margaret was in her 60s, wearing a black dress and pearl necklace. Sarah was younger, maybe 40, with her uncle's sharp eyes and calculating expression. They didn't look at Marcus, didn't acknowledge him at all, as if he was beneath their notice, just an obstacle to be removed. The bailiff called them in. The courtroom was wood-paneled and formal, with high ceilings and windows that let in gray winter light. Judge Patricia Caldwell sat at the bench, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. "This is a matter of disputed inheritance and property rights," Judge Caldwell began once everyone was seated. "The plaintiff, representing the estate of Arthur Brennan, claims rightful ownership of assets found on property formerly belonging to the deceased. The defendant, Marcus Webb, claims legal ownership of said property and all contents therein under Oregon's abandoned property statutes. Let's begin with the plaintiff's case. Patricia Hollis stood, smoothing her designer suit. Your Honor, Arthur Brennan was a brilliant man who, due to mental health struggles in his later years, became increasingly paranoid and reclusive. He withdrew from society and hid his fortune, not as an act of conscience as the defendant has suggested, but as a symptom of declining mental capacity. That fortune rightfully belongs to his surviving family. She gestured to Margaret and Sarah. These women have spent 20 years mourning Arthur's loss, seeking closure, hoping against hope that he might return. They never gave up on him. And now, when they should finally have some resolution, some recovery of what was stolen from them by Arthur's illness, they're being denied by an opportunist who stumbled onto their family's tragedy. Patricia continued, painting Marcus as a desperate man willing to exploit legal technicalities to steal from a grieving family. She produced documents showing Arthur's documented eccentricities in his final years, psychiatric evaluations from years earlier, anything that suggested mental incompetence. Marcus sat listening, feeling smaller with each word. She made him sound like a vulture, a parasite feeding on others' misfortune. Then it was Donald's turn. The old lawyer stood slowly, his age evident in his movements, but his voice was clear and strong. Your Honor, I've practiced estate law in Oregon for 40 years. I've seen complicated cases and simple ones, fair outcomes and unjust ones. This case is actually quite simple, despite the plaintiff's attempts to complicate it. He walked to the evidence table and picked up a copy of Arthur's journal. Arthur Brennan was not mentally incompetent. This journal, written over a period of years, shows clear, rational thinking. He documented his reasons for withdrawing from public life with precision and purpose. He wasn't paranoid, he was guilty, and he was trying to atone. Donald read excerpts from the journal, Arthur's own words describing his deliberate choice to hide his fortune, his hope that it would one day help those his business practices had harmed. The plaintiff claims Mr. Brennan's family never gave up on him. The evidence suggests otherwise. After his disappearance, they made minimal efforts to locate him. They filed a missing person report, yes, but they didn't hire private investigators. They didn't conduct extensive searches. Within 3 years, they had him declared legally dead so they could claim what little remained of his visible estate. Patricia objected, but Judge Caldwell waved her down. Let him finish. Donald continued. Oregon law is clear. Personal property found on legally acquired land, when said property has been abandoned for more than 7 years and the owner is deceased, becomes the property of the landowner. Arthur Brennan was declared dead 8 years ago. The property was publicly auctioned with no restrictions. Marcus Webb purchased it legally, discovered the vault legally, and claimed its contents legally. But, Your Honor, Patricia interjected, my clients are the rightful heirs. The rightful heirs to what? Donald interrupted. To money Arthur Brennan deliberately hid from them? To a fortune he specifically chose not to will to them? Arthur left no will. He named no beneficiaries. He vanished without giving them access to his assets. That was his choice, and the law respects that choice. The arguments went back and forth for 3 hours. Patricia produced testimony from psychiatrists who'd treated Arthur decades earlier. Donald produced the journal entries showing clear intent. Patricia argued about family rights. Donald argued about property law. Finally, Judge Caldwell held up her hand. Enough. I've heard both sides. This court will take a brief recess while I review the evidence and consider the arguments. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. Those 30 minutes felt like 30 years. Marcus sat in the hallway, his leg bouncing nervously, while Donald reviewed notes and Jack paced like a caged tiger. Rose had driven up from Pine Haven and was sitting quietly, praying under her breath. When they were called back in, Marcus's heart was hammering so hard he thought everyone could hear it. Judge Caldwell looked at both parties, her expression unreadable. This is a complicated case that touches on issues of property law, inheritance rights, and moral philosophy, she began. However, the law is clear. Arthur Brennan was declared deceased after a 7-year absence. His property, including the land now owned by Mr. Webb, was legally sold at public auction with no restrictions or claims filed at that time. The assets found on that property fall under Oregon's Abandoned Property Statute Section 131.550. Marcus held his breath. However, the judge continued, I'm also troubled by the circumstances. Mr. Brennan's family has raised valid concerns about intent and rightful inheritance. Therefore, I'm making the following ruling. She looked directly at Marcus. The assets are legally the property of Marcus Webb. However, given their origin and the ethical questions surrounding them, I'm ordering that Mr. Webb establish a trust to manage the funds, with oversight from an independent board. The trust must allocate a portion, no less than 30%, to charitable causes that benefit those affected by economic hardship, as appears to have been Arthur Brennan's final wish. The gavel came down. Marcus sat stunned. He'd won. Sort of. The money was his, but with conditions, with responsibilities, with oversight. Patricia Hollis stood angrily. Your Honor, we intend to appeal. That's your right, Judge Caldwell said, but my ruling stands pending appeal. Mr. Webb, you've stumbled into extraordinary circumstances. I hope you have the wisdom to handle them responsibly. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Marcus pushed through them without comment, following Donald to the parking lot. Once they were in the car, away from the cameras and questions, Marcus finally let himself react. I won, he said, his voice shaky. You did, Donald confirmed. With conditions. But yes, you won. What does it mean? Marcus asked. The trust, the oversight, the 30%? It means you can't just take the money and run, Donald explained. You'll need to establish a legal trust, probably a foundation. You'll need a board of directors to provide oversight. And you'll need to donate at least 30% to charitable causes. But the rest is yours to manage as you see fit. That's fair, Marcus said quietly. That's more than fair. Jack clapped him on the shoulder from the back seat. You did good, kid. Real good. Marcus looked out the window at the gray Oregon sky and thought about Arthur Brennan, about Sarah, about all the people who'd suffered while others profited. He thought about Lily and the life she deserved. He thought about Rose and Dale and everyone in Pine Haven who'd shown him kindness when they didn't have to, and he made a decision. I want to donate more than 30%, he said suddenly. Donald glanced at him. What? Arthur was right. This money came from suffering. I can't just keep most of it and feel good about giving away the minimum. I want to do more. How much more? Donald asked carefully. Marcus thought about it, about what he actually needed versus what he wanted, about the difference between security and excess. Half, he said. 50% goes to helping people. The other 50% I'll use to take care of Lily, to help people in Pine Haven, to make sure I can keep doing good work without worrying about survival. Marcus, Donald said gently, that's over $100 million you're giving away. I know, Marcus said, but I don't need $100 million. I need enough to give Lily a good life and to sleep at night knowing I did the right thing. This feels right. Rose, who'd been quiet up until now, reached forward and squeezed his shoulder. Sarah would be proud of you, she said softly. Marcus felt tears in his eyes. I hope so. The drive back to Pine Haven was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled into town, Marcus saw how it looked with new eyes. The boarded-up storefronts, the struggling families, the people working multiple jobs just to survive. This town had given him shelter when he had nowhere else to go. It had given him community when he felt alone, and now, impossibly, he had the resources to give something back. Not just charity. Real change. Real opportunity. Real hope. By the time they reached the shipping container, Marcus had a plan forming in his mind. It would take time to implement, It would take help and expertise and probably some mistakes along the way. But for the first time since Sarah died, Marcus felt like he had a purpose beyond just surviving. He was going to build something that mattered, something that lasted, something that honored both Arthur Brennan's guilty conscience and Sarah's generous spirit. Lily ran out to meet them as they pulled up, Rose's daughter having brought her home from school. She threw herself into Marcus's arms, and he held her tight. "Did you win, Daddy?" she asked. Marcus looked at this beautiful child, this miracle who'd given him a reason to keep fighting even when everything felt hopeless. "Yeah, baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We won." And this time, for the first time in a long time, winning actually meant something. The trust was established within 6 weeks of the court ruling. Donald worked with financial advisors, accountants, and legal experts to create a structure that would protect the assets while ensuring they were used as Judge Caldwell had ordered. They called it the Brennan Webb Foundation for Economic Recovery and Hope. Marcus had insisted on the double name. Arthur Brennan started this, he'd said firmly during one of their planning meetings. His guilt, his conscience, his choice to hide this money until someone could use it right. I'm just the person who found it. Both names deserve to be there. The Foundation's mission was written on the first page of its charter, words that Marcus and Donald had crafted together over countless cups of coffee at Donald's kitchen table, to provide direct assistance to individuals and families facing economic hardship through no fault of their own, with special focus on medical debt, housing insecurity, and emergency relief. To remember that behind every financial crisis is a human story, and that dignity matters as much as dollars. The legal battles didn't end with Judge Caldwell's ruling. Patricia Hollis filed appeals on behalf of the Brennan family as promised. But each appeal was denied, and after 8 months of procedural motions and legal maneuvering, the family finally gave up. Margaret Brennan released a statement through her attorney expressing disappointment but accepting the court's decision. Sarah Brennan disappeared from public view entirely. Marcus didn't gloat. He understood their anger, their sense of loss. In different circumstances, he might have felt the same way. But he also believed, deep in his bones, that this outcome was what Arthur Brennan had wanted. The journal made that clear. The letter tucked in its back cover made it even clearer. This money wasn't meant to make anyone rich. It was meant to do good. The foundation opened its first office in March, in a renovated storefront on Main Street in Pine Haven. The building had been vacant for 5 years, its windows boarded up, its for rent sign faded by sun and rain. Marcus paid 6 months' rent up front and hired a contractor to gut and renovate it. New paint, new floors, new windows, a waiting area with comfortable chairs and magazines, private offices where people could share their stories without shame. He hired 3 staff members, all local, all people who understood struggle from personal experience. Teresa, a 45-year-old woman who'd lost her house to medical debt after her son's cancer treatment. Miguel, a veteran who'd been homeless for 2 years before getting back on his feet. And Janet, a retired social worker who'd spent 30 years helping families navigate crises. "I need people who won't judge," Marcus had explained during the hiring interviews. "People who remember what it's like to need help. People who can see past the paperwork to the humans underneath." On opening day, a cold Tuesday morning with rain threatening, Marcus stood outside the storefront with Donald, Rose, and Jack. A small crowd had gathered, maybe 30 people, curious or supportive or skeptical. Dale from the lumberyard was there, Frank from the diner, Margaret the librarian, Sheriff Tom Hayes in uniform, and Lily, holding tight to Rose's hand, wearing a new coat that actually fit her properly. Marcus had prepared a speech, had written notes on index cards that were currently crumpled in his pocket. But when he looked at the faces of his neighbors, people who'd watched him struggle and fall and somehow keep going, the prepared words felt wrong. "I'm not good at speeches," he began, his voice carrying in the morning quiet. "I'm just a guy who got really lucky. Or maybe unlucky, depending on how you look at it. I bought a shipping container because I was desperate, and I found something that changed my life." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But here's what I learned. Money doesn't fix everything. It can't bring back people we've lost. It can't undo the pain we've experienced. What it can do, if we use it right, is give people a chance to breathe, a chance to hope, a chance to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. This foundation exists because a man named Arthur Brennan made terrible choices and spent his final years trying to atone for them. It exists because Judge Caldwell believed that wealth comes with responsibility. And it exists because I know, personally, what it feels like to be one disaster away from losing everything." His voice cracked slightly. "If you're struggling, if you're drowning in debt or one paycheck from homelessness, if you're choosing between medicine and food, come talk to us. No judgment, no shame, just help. That's what we're here for." Lily let go of Rose's hand and ran to Marcus, wrapping her arms around his waist. He pulled her close, and she looked up at him with those big brown eyes that were so much like Sarah's. "Can I say something?" she asked. Marcus nodded, surprised. Lily turned to face the crowd, suddenly shy but determined. "My mom died 2 years ago," she said, her voice small but clear. "And after that, everything got really hard. We lost our house, and we lived in our truck, and I was scared all the time. But my dad never gave up. He worked really hard, and he kept me safe, and he taught me that being poor doesn't mean you're bad." She looked up at Marcus again. "And now we can help other people who are scared like we were, and I think my mom would really like that." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. The first person through the door was an elderly woman Marcus didn't recognize. She was maybe 70, thin and worn, carrying a folder of papers with shaking hands. Teresa greeted her warmly, offered coffee, and led her to a private office. 20 minutes later, Teresa came out and pulled Marcus aside. "Her name is Dorothy. She's about to lose her house, medical bills from her late husband. The bank is foreclosing in 2 weeks. She came here as a last resort, doesn't think anyone can help, but her daughter saw our flyer at the grocery store." "How much does she owe?" Marcus asked. $38,000. Marcus didn't hesitate. "Pay it, all of it, save her house." Teresa's eyes widened. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Marcus confirmed. "That's why we're here." By the end of the first week, the foundation had helped 17 families, paid off medical debts totaling $212,000, covered 3 months of rent for a family facing eviction, bought a reliable used car for a single father who'd been walking 4 miles each way to work, paid for emergency dental work for a woman in constant pain who couldn't afford treatment. The need was overwhelming, endless, a tide of human suffering that no amount of money could fully address. But Marcus tried. He worked 16-hour days, reviewing applications, meeting with families, making sure every dollar went where it could do the most good. Donald had insisted on oversight, a board of directors to ensure the foundation operated ethically and sustainably. The board included Donald himself, Rose, Jack, and 3 financial experts from Portland who'd agreed to serve pro bono. They met monthly to review expenditures, adjust policies, and make sure Marcus wasn't bankrupting the foundation with generosity. "You have $130 million, Donald reminded him during one heated board meeting. "That sounds like a lot, but if you're not careful, you could spend it all in a year. We need to invest wisely. Create sustainable programs, make this last." Marcus knew he was right. But it was hard to say no when a mother was crying in his office, explaining that her son needed medication that cost $3,000 a month and insurance wouldn't cover it. Hard to prioritize fiscal responsibility over the faces of people who reminded him of himself just months ago. They found a balance eventually. Direct assistance for emergency cases, longer-term programs for systemic issues, partnerships with existing nonprofits and community organizations. The foundation became not just a source of money, but a hub for resources, connecting people with services, advocating for policy changes, building networks of support, and slowly, visibly, Pine Haven began to change. The elementary school, struggling with outdated textbooks and crumbling infrastructure, received a grant for renovations and new technology. Teachers wept when they saw the new computers, the fresh paint, the playground equipment that didn't rust or wobble. The volunteer fire department, operating with equipment from the 1980s, got a new truck and updated safety gear. The chief, a man named Bob, who'd been volunteering for 30 years, stood in front of the gleaming red truck with his crew and couldn't speak for a full minute. Small businesses on Main Street, barely hanging on, received interest-free loans to upgrade equipment, expand inventory, and hire staff. Within 6 months, 3 of the boarded-up storefronts had reopened. A bookstore, a cafe, a thrift shop that donated profits to local families. But Marcus's generosity wasn't limitless or indiscriminate. He said no to plenty of requests. People who wanted money for vacations or luxury items, businesses with poor track records, anyone who couldn't demonstrate genuine need or a realistic plan. The foundation had standards, and Marcus enforced them, even when it was uncomfortable. "We're not a lottery," he'd explained to one angry applicant who'd been denied. "We're here to help people who are genuinely struggling through no fault of their own. That's the mission, and I won't compromise it." The rejection hurt, but it was necessary. The foundation had to be sustainable, responsible, trustworthy. Otherwise it would burn bright and die fast, and all the good it could do would be lost. Marcus's personal life changed too, though more slowly than he'd expected. He moved out of the shipping container into a modest house near Lily's school. Nothing extravagant, just a 3-bedroom ranch with a fenced yard and working heat. Lily got her own room with new furniture and a closet full of clothes that actually fit. Marcus got a bed, a real bed, instead of a sleeping bag on the floor. But he kept the container. He couldn't bring himself to sell it or tear it down. Instead, he renovated it carefully, preserving its essential character while making it safe and weatherproof. He sealed the vault beneath, photographing everything first, creating a detailed archive of what had been there. Then he turned the container itself into something new, a museum and community space. Inside, he hung photographs of Arthur Brennan, his journal entries printed and framed, the story of how one man's guilt became another man's salvation. He included his own story too, honest and unflinching. The medical bills, the eviction notices, the nights in his truck, the desperate purchase at auction. "I want people to see the whole truth," Marcus told Donald when the lawyer suggested softening some of the details. "The shame, the fear, the luck. Because poverty isn't noble, and getting out of it wasn't just about working hard. It was about a chance, a wild, impossible chance. Most people don't get that. And I want everyone who visits this place to remember that." The Brennan Webb Memorial opened 6 months after the foundation, on a warm September afternoon. It wasn't just a museum. It was also a community gathering space, with tables and chairs, a small library, and a kitchen where volunteers served coffee and snacks. Anyone could come, to learn, to think, to just sit somewhere warm and dry and feel less alone. Lily had been instrumental in the design, insisting on bright colors and comfortable furniture. "It shouldn't feel like a sad place," she'd argued. "It should feel like hope." She was right. The opening ceremony drew a bigger crowd than Marcus expected. Over 200 people from Pine Haven and beyond. News crews from Portland, reporters from newspapers, even a documentary filmmaker who'd been following the foundation's work. But the moment that mattered most came after the speeches, after the ribbon cutting, when the crowd had dispersed and Marcus was alone in the container for a few minutes. He sat at Arthur's old desk, now polished and preserved, and ran his fingers over the wood where Arthur had written his confession. He thought about the man he'd never met but felt he knew intimately, A man who'd made terrible choices and spent his final years drowning in guilt. A man who'd hoped that hiding his fortune might somehow lead to redemption. "I think you'd be proud," Marcus whispered to the ghost in the room. "I hope you'd be proud." A voice behind him made him turn. It was Sarah Brennan, Arthur's niece, the one who'd sat in court looking angry and entitled. She stood in the doorway, dressed simply in jeans and a sweater, looking smaller and more human than she had in that courtroom. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said quietly. "I saw the news about the opening. I wanted to see it." Marcus stood, unsure how to react. "You're welcome here." Sarah walked slowly through the space, reading the displays, looking at the photographs. When she reached the section about Arthur's journal, she stopped for a long time. "I didn't know him," she finally said. "Not really. My mother, his sister, she talked about him sometimes. The successful businessman, the wealthy uncle. But after he disappeared, she only talked about the money, what we'd lost, what we deserved." She turned to Marcus, tears in her eyes. "I was angry at you, furious. But I've been watching what you're doing with the foundation. And I realize now that you're doing what Arthur wanted, what he couldn't do himself." "Your family tried to stop me," Marcus said, not accusingly, just stating fact. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. My brother and we've withdrawn from the appeals, officially and permanently. We donated $10,000 to the foundation. It's not much compared to what you found, but it's what we can afford." She smiled sadly. "Maybe it's our own small attempt at atonement." Marcus felt something shift inside him. He'd spent months angry at the Brennan family, seeing them as greedy obstacles. But Sarah, standing here, vulnerable and honest, reminded him that everyone had their own struggles, their own journeys. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means a lot." After Sarah left, Marcus found Lily outside, playing with some other kids from town. She was laughing, really laughing, the kind of free, unself-conscious joy he hadn't heard from her since before Sarah's diagnosis. He watched her for a moment, his heart full. Rose came to stand beside him. "She's healing," the old woman observed. "We both are," Marcus agreed. "You've done something remarkable here," Rose said. "Not just with the money, but with your heart. You could have kept it all, lived like a king, moved away to somewhere fancy. Instead, you stayed. You helped. You remembered where you came from." Marcus shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. You helped. Donald, Jack, everyone in this town. None of this happens if people don't show up." "Maybe," Rose allowed, "but you were the one brave enough to fight for it, brave enough to use it right." That evening, after everyone had gone home and the container was empty, Marcus sat on the steps outside, watching the sun set over the pine trees. Lily came and sat beside him, leaning against his shoulder. "Daddy," she said softly. "Yeah, baby?" "Do you think Mom can see us? From wherever she is?" Marcus felt his throat tighten. It was a question she'd asked before, in different ways, seeking reassurance that Sarah hadn't simply vanished, but was somehow still present. "I think she can," Marcus said carefully. "And I think she's proud of you, of how strong you've been, how kind." "Is she proud of you too?" Marcus thought about that, about the man he'd been when Sarah was alive, full of dreams but uncertain of his path. About the man he'd become after her death, broken and desperate, barely holding on. And about the man he was now, still scarred but purposeful, using his impossible luck to honor her memory. "I hope so," he said honestly. "I'm trying to be the person she believed I could be." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think you're doing a really good job." Marcus pulled her close, blinking back tears. "Thank you, baby. That means everything." 2 years after buying the shipping container, the foundation had helped over 7,000 families. They'd paid off $23 million in medical debt, created emergency relief funds that had prevented countless evictions, partnered with schools, fire departments, and community organizations across 3 counties, built a network of support that reached far beyond Pine Haven's borders. But the impact wasn't just measured in dollars, it was in the stories. The veteran who'd been able to afford his medications and was now volunteering at the foundation. The single mother who'd escaped an abusive relationship with the foundation's help and was now studying to be a social worker. The elderly couple who'd kept their home and now hosted community dinners every month. Each story was a thread, and together they wove something larger than Marcus had ever imagined possible. A community not just of recipients, but of participants. People helping people. The foundation had sparked something, but the town itself had caught fire with possibility. Main Street was alive again. The bookstore hosted author readings. The cafe had open mic nights. The thrift shop ran job training programs. New families were moving to Pine Haven, attracted by the schools, the community spirit, the sense that something special was happening here. The lumber yard had hired 15 new workers. Frank's Diner had expanded, adding a second dining room. Even the old quarry on the edge of town, abandoned for decades, had been purchased by a developer who planned to turn it into a park and recreation area. Not everyone was happy with the changes. Some longtime residents complained about traffic, about newcomers, about the town feeling different than it used to. Marcus understood their concerns, but couldn't regret the transformation. Yes, Pine Haven was changing, but it was changing into something alive, something hopeful, something that gave people reasons to stay instead of reasons to leave. On a crisp October morning, the town held a celebration. Officially, it was the Pine Haven Fall Festival, an annual tradition that had barely survived the past decade. But this year was different. The foundation had sponsored it, provided funding for vendors, entertainment, and activities. The whole town turned out. Marcus walked through the festival with Lily, past booths selling crafts and food, past families playing games and kids getting their faces painted. Everywhere he looked, he saw people who'd been touched by the foundation. Dorothy, the elderly woman who'd been the first person through the door, now volunteered 3 days a week. Teresa, Miguel, and Janet, the original staff, had hired assistants and expanded their programs. Dale, Frank, Margaret, all the people who'd shown him kindness when he had nothing, now thriving in a town that was thriving. A small stage had been set up in the town square, and around noon, Mayor Richards, a kind but ineffectual man who'd held the office for 20 years, called for everyone's attention. "I want to take a moment," the mayor said into the microphone, "to recognize someone special. 2 years ago, Marcus Webb bought an old shipping container on the edge of town. A lot of folks, myself included, thought he'd made a mistake, but Marcus saw possibility where others saw rust. And more importantly, when he found something valuable, he didn't keep it for himself. He shared it. He built something that's transformed our community." The crowd applauded, and Marcus felt his face flush. "Marcus, would you come up here?" the mayor asked. Reluctantly, Marcus made his way to the stage. He didn't like attention, didn't enjoy being singled out. But he understood this moment was important, that the town needed to mark how far they'd come. "I'm not good at speeches," Marcus said into the microphone, the same words he'd used at the foundation's opening. "But I want to say something important. This isn't about me. It's about all of us. Every person who volunteers at the foundation, every business owner who hired someone when they didn't have to, every neighbor who looked out for a struggling family, every kid who donated their allowance to help someone else." He looked out at the crowd, at faces he now knew, at a community he was proud to call home. 2 years ago, I was desperate, broke, living in my truck with my daughter. I bought that container because I had no other choice. And yeah, I got lucky, impossibly lucky. But luck is just opportunity. What matters is what you do with it. Arthur Brennan, the man who hid that fortune, he couldn't figure out how to do good with his wealth. It paralyzed him. But he had hope that someone else might be braver, might be better. And you know what? It wasn't me who was braver. It was all of you. You welcomed me when you could have judged. You helped when you could have looked away. You built this community together. His voice cracked with emotion. "I'm just the guy who bought the container. You're the ones who made it matter." The applause was thunderous. People were crying, hugging each other, celebrating not just Marcus but themselves, what they'd built together. After his speech, people came up to thank him, to share their stories, to tell him how the foundation had changed their lives. Marcus listened to each one, committed them to memory. These weren't statistics or case files, they were human beings, each with their own struggles and triumphs. Late in the afternoon, as the sun was setting and the festival was winding down, Marcus found himself back at the shipping container. It sat on the edge of town, preserved and painted, surrounded by gardens that volunteers had planted. Solar lights lined the pathway to the door. Donald, Rose, and Jack found him there. The unlikely alliance that had helped him survive the legal battles and build something lasting. "Quite a day," Donald said, settling onto a bench with a satisfied sigh. "Quite a couple of years," Jack added. Rose smiled at Marcus. "You know what I'm proudest of?" "What?" Marcus asked. "That you stayed yourself. You didn't let the money change who you are. You're still the same man who fixed my porch, who tucked his daughter in at night, who saw people instead of problems. That's rare." Marcus thought about that. Had he stayed the same? In some ways, yes. He still worried about Lily, still worked too hard, still remembered what it felt like to be powerless. But he'd also grown. He'd learned to accept help. He'd learned that money was a tool, not a solution. He'd learned that changing the world didn't require perfection, just persistence. "I had good teachers," Marcus said, looking at these three people who'd become family. As darkness fell and the festival's lights twinkled in the distance, Lily came running up, breathless and excited. "Daddy, they're doing fireworks. Can we watch?" Marcus picked her up, even though she was getting too big for it, and carried her to a spot where they could see. The first firework exploded overhead, gold and silver against the black sky, and Lily gasped with delight. Marcus held his daughter and watched the lights, thinking about how far they'd come. From desperate and homeless to secure and purposeful, from invisible to valued, from surviving to thriving. But more than that, he thought about all the families the foundation had helped, all the people who'd been given a second chance just like he'd been given. About Dorothy keeping her home, about the veteran getting his medicine, about the single mother escaping abuse, about the kids going to schools with new books and playgrounds. Each firework that burst overhead represented a story, a life changed, a hope restored. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory, something she'd said years ago when they were young and dreaming of the future. "We're supposed to leave the world better than we found it. That's the whole point." "I'm trying, love," Marcus whispered to the sky, to her spirit, to the universe. "I'm trying." Lily looked up at him. "Did you say something, Daddy?" "Just thanking your mom," Marcus said, "for teaching me what matters." "What matters?" Lily asked, though Marcus suspected she already knew. "People," Marcus said simply. "People matter. Everything else is just noise." The fireworks continued, painting the sky with color and light, while the town of Pinehaven celebrated below. And in that moment, surrounded by community, holding his daughter, honoring his wife's memory, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the peace of having no problems. He still faced challenges every day, decisions about the foundation, worries about doing enough, concerns about staying true to Arthur's vision, but the peace of knowing he was living with purpose, the peace of using his impossible luck to lift others up. The peace of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. The shipping container stood behind them, no longer a symbol of desperation, but of transformation, from rust to hope, from hiding to sharing, from one man's guilt to an entire community's healing. And it all started with one desperate choice: $850, a shipping container, a hidden vault, and the courage to fight for something bigger than himself. Years from now, long after Marcus was gone, people would still tell this story. They'd tell it to their children and grandchildren, the tale of the broke single dad who found a fortune and used it to save a town. They'd simplify it, maybe, turn it into legend, strip away the messy reality of legal battles and hard choices and sleepless nights. But those who really knew, those who'd lived through it, would remember the truth. That transformation isn't magic. It's not luck or destiny or divine intervention. It's people choosing again and again to do the hard right thing instead of the easy wrong thing. It's communities deciding to lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. It's individuals using whatever power they have, whether it's billions of dollars or just a kind word, to make someone else's burden a little lighter. Marcus Webb hadn't set out to be a hero. He'd just been trying to survive, to give his daughter a roof over her head, to honor the memory of a wife taken too soon. But in doing those simple things with courage and compassion, he'd accidentally built something extraordinary. Not a foundation, not a fortune, not a legacy carved in marble, but something better. A reminder that second chances are possible. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That the measure of wealth isn't in what you keep, but in what you give away. And that sometimes the most valuable thing hidden in the darkness isn't gold or cash or bearer bonds, it's hope. As the final firework exploded overhead in a cascade of silver light, Lily leaned against Marcus's shoulder and yawned. "Can we go home now, Daddy?" Home. Not a container or a truck or a shelter, but a real home, with warmth and security and love. "Yeah, baby," Marcus said, his voice thick with gratitude and wonder. "Let's go home." And hand in hand, father and daughter walked back into the town they'd helped transform, into the life they'd built from rust and desperation and impossible luck. Into a future that finally looked bright, because Marcus Webb had learned the most important truth of all. Fortune doesn't favor the lucky. It favors the compassionate. And compassion, more than any vault full of gold, is the real treasure that changes the world. Anyone can stumble upon fortune if fate decides to smile. But it takes something much rarer, much more valuable, to use that fortune to lift others up rather than yourself above. It takes humility to remember where you came from when everything changes. It takes courage to put purpose before profit. And it takes love, the kind that's bigger than yourself, to transform good fortune into lasting good. Marcus Webb learned all of that in a rusted shipping container on the forgotten edge of a small town. And in learning it, he taught everyone watching that the measure of a person isn't what they find in life's hidden vaults, but what they choose to build with it afterward. His legacy wasn't measured in dollars or headlines or marble monuments. It was measured in families saved, dreams restored, and the simple, powerful truth that compassion will always be worth more than gold. Because for Marcus, for Lily, and for the thousands of lives they touched, the story was never really about a vault full of money. It was about a heart full of hope, and that made all the difference. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful true stories waiting for you. Click to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe second chances can change the world.